It was just another quiet evening in the home of Jonathan and Angela, a couple who had spent years together, building a life filled with love, laughter, and shared memories. They had learned to cherish the moments of peace after all the struggles and challenges they'd faced, especially Jonathan, who had spent many years serving his country. After retiring from the military, he was finally able to enjoy a calmer, quieter life with his wife. They had settled into their suburban home, far away from the chaos of his military days. They spent evenings on the couch, watching TV, sharing stories, and simply enjoying each other's company. Jonathan was a man who had seen the worst of the world. He had experienced the kinds of challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. But now, in his retirement, he embraced the simplicity of his new life. He worked on small home improvement projects, spent time outdoors, and most importantly, enjoyed being present with Angela. He often looked at her with gratitude. She was his rock, the one person who had supported him through thick and thin, through the highs and lows of his military service. And now, as he adjusted to life outside the uniform, Angela, too, had adjusted well to the slower pace of their lives. She was an outgoing, caring woman, always ready to lend a helping hand to friends and neighbors. They both had found peace in their routines. They spent their weekends together, enjoying each other's company and helping around the house. It was a stark contrast to the years when Jonathan was constantly away, battling in foreign lands and trying to make a difference in the world. But that evening, everything changed. It started like any other evening. Jonathan had just finished dinner and Angela was cleaning up in the kitchen. They had just settled in for a movie night, the kind of night where the world outside didn't matter, and it was just the two of them, in their little bubble of comfort. The TV flickered softly in the background, casting a warm glow over the room. Then a knock at the door shattered the calm. Jonathan paused, his hand still on the remote control. A sense of unease quickly washed over him, though he didn't know why. He stood up, walking toward the door, his military instincts kicking in. It was late, far too late for anyone to be visiting. When he opened the door, there was no one standing there at first. But then, he saw movement from the corner of his eye. Several figures dressed in black uniforms suddenly appeared at the edges of the porch. The sight took him by surprise and his heart skipped a beat. Before he could even speak, the figures, whom he now realized were police officers, had already surrounded his home. Jonathan's first reaction was to stay calm. His military training had prepared him for situations like this. He knew how to deal with high-stress encounters even if they were unexpected. But this wasn't just any situation. It felt wrong from the start. The officers weren't friendly, and they didn't offer any explanation for their presence. Instead, they barked orders demanding that he step outside. Angela, hearing the commotion, had already walked into the room. She stood next to Jonathan, looking just as confused as he was. She looked at him with a questioning glance, her face a mixture of concern and uncertainty. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jonathan didn't have a clear answer. He glanced at the officers, trying to make sense of the situation. "What's this about?" he asked firmly. He didn't raise his voice, but his tone carried an air of authority. The years of military service had given him confidence in moments like this, even when things seemed to spiral out of control. One of the officers stepped forward. He had a stern look on his face, his eyes hidden behind dark sunglasses. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," the officer said, his voice cold and detached. "We need to search the premises." Jonathan felt a knot form in his stomach. This wasn't just a simple check-in or a case of mistaken identity. There was something more to it. But before he could ask for more details, another officer moved closer, and the atmosphere became charged with tension. "We don't have time for questions," the officer continued, his words dripping with authority. "Step aside." Jonathan stood his ground. He had been in situations where he had to make quick decisions under pressure, but this felt different. The officers were acting with a sense of urgency, but there was no explanation for why they had shown up at his door. And worse still, their tone was growing more hostile by the second. Angela, sensing the escalating tension, took a step closer to her husband. "Jonathan, what should we do?" she whispered, her eyes wide with fear. She wasn't used to feeling scared in her own home, but the officer's aggressive behavior was making her feel uneasy. "I don't know," Jonathan said, keeping his voice calm. He turned back to the officers. "I'm a veteran. I served this country. I have every right to know why you're here." But his words didn't seem to matter. The officers were not interested in explaining anything. Instead, they pressed forward, ignoring Jonathan's attempts to reason with them. The scene felt like something out of a nightmare. Jonathan's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He was trying to remain composed, but it was hard when everything about this situation felt wrong. Before he could react further, one of the officers suddenly pushed past him and grabbed Angela. The moment happened so quickly that it took Jonathan a second to process what was happening. He watched, horrified, as the officer yanked Angela out of the doorway and pulled her toward the officers who were now surrounding them. "Let go of her," Jonathan shouted, his voice filled with panic and anger. But it was too late. Without warning, one of the officers raised a taser and fired it at Angela. The electric pulse hit her square in the chest, and she collapsed to the ground with a scream of pain. The shock of the taser caused her muscles to spasm uncontrollably, and she writhed on the ground, unable to move. Jonathan's heart sank. It was as if everything he had worked for, his peaceful life, his sense of security, was being ripped away in front of him. His wife, the person he loved most in the world, was on the floor, helpless, as the officers showed no remorse. "Stop! What are you doing?" Jonathan yelled, rushing forward to help her. But the officers didn't listen. They simply stood there, their expressions hard and unmoving. Jonathan couldn't believe what was happening. It was as though the years of sacrifice he had made for his country, the training and discipline that had shaped him into the man he was, meant nothing in this moment. The people who were supposed to protect and serve were now the ones causing harm. As Jonathan knelt beside Angela, trying to comfort her, his mind raced. He was no longer just a husband trying to protect his wife. He was a man who had seen the worst of humanity, but never in his wildest dreams did he think that he would be facing something like this in his own home. This wasn't just an attack on his wife. It was an attack on his dignity, his sense of safety, and his belief in the system that he had once fought to protect. And as the officers stood around them, waiting for him to comply, Jonathan knew that the only way out of this was to take control of the situation. But how could he make them listen? What could he do to make them realize that they were wrong? Jonathan's heart raced as he watched Angela lying on the ground, the effects of the taser still seizing her body. He could barely make sense of what was happening around him. His military training had taught him to stay calm under pressure, but this moment felt different. The world around him seemed to blur as he kneeled beside his wife, his mind scrambling for a solution. "Angela, hold on. Stay with me," he whispered, his voice thick with fear and disbelief. His hands hovered over her, not sure what to do next. He wanted to help her, but the scene was chaos. Officers were moving around them, barking orders, and his thoughts were racing in 100 different directions. He felt a surge of anger, but it wasn't the kind of anger that made him lash out. It was the kind of anger that comes from deep frustration, anger at the injustice of it all. He had been a soldier, fighting for the very freedoms that were supposed to protect him, and yet here he was in his own home watching his wife suffer at the hands of those who were supposed to be the good guys. "Please," Jonathan said, his voice shaky but firm. "Can you help her? She's not resisting. Please just let her up." He looked around at the officers, his eyes trying to make contact with someone, anyone, who might show some sign of humanity, but no one seemed to care. The officers didn't seem to be moved by his pleas or by Angela's pain. Instead, they stood in place, their faces blank and hard. The officer who had tased Angela was now walking back to his position, as though this was just another routine operation. Jonathan could feel his frustration growing by the second. He didn't know what he had to do to make them realize how wrong they were. Angela gasped for air, her body still twitching from the electrical shock. Jonathan's mind was a blur. He knew he had to do something, but every movement, every word felt like it was being swallowed by the overwhelming noise of the situation. "Why are you doing this?" Jonathan shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "She's not a threat. To you!" The officer who had tased Angela turned toward him with an icy look. "Stay back," he said, his voice cold and unmoving. "We don't need any more problems." Jonathan's chest tightened. He couldn't just sit back and watch this happen. His wife was still on the ground, struggling to breathe. The helplessness he felt was like a weight on his chest, suffocating him. He wasn't about to let them get away with this. Not without at least trying to stand up for her. His military training kicked in again, and for a split second, Jonathan felt his old self coming back. The soldier who had faced danger in faraway places, who had seen things that most people could never imagine. The soldier who knew how to handle high-pressure situations. "Angela, just breathe. You're okay, just breathe," he murmured, trying to calm her as she lay on the ground. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her face twisted in pain. He could see the fear in her eyes, and it tore him apart. Turning back to the officers, Jonathan's voice grew louder. "You can't just do this. You can't treat people like this." His words were sharp, filled with a growing sense of justice. He wasn't just speaking for Angela anymore. He was speaking for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, for everyone who had ever felt powerless. He took a step toward the officers, his posture straight, the way he had been taught to stand tall in the face of authority. "I've served this country," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I've put my life on the line. I've fought for the very freedoms you claim to protect. And this is not how we treat each other. This is wrong." For a brief moment, there was silence. The officers froze as if his words had cut through the tension that had been hanging in the air. Jonathan could feel the shift, though he didn't know exactly what had caused it. The officer who had tased. Angela paused, looking at him with a hard stare, but for the first time there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Jonathan didn't let the moment slip away. He knew he had to keep pushing. "I didn't risk my life so that I could come home to this," he continued, his voice rising now, stronger than before. "I fought for justice, for fairness, and you're supposed to uphold those things, not tear them down." There was another pause, a long, heavy silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, Jonathan could see the officers shifting uncomfortably. Some of them glanced at each other, their eyes momentarily leaving Jonathan's. He wasn't sure if it was because they had never seen someone stand up to them like this, or if they were finally starting to question their own actions. The officer, who had spoken earlier, took a step back. His expression was hard to read, but there was something different about the way he stood now. Less certain, less aggressive. His hand, which had been tightly gripping his taser just moments ago, now rested by his side, though he didn't put it away. Jonathan didn't back down. He stood tall, his eyes unwavering. He knew this was his moment, the moment where his words could change the direction of this encounter. He had no idea if it would work, but he couldn't let this go on any longer. His wife needed help, and he needed the officers to understand that what they were doing was wrong. Finally, the officer who had been in charge of the operation spoke again, his voice softer this time. "You need to calm down," he said, his tone less demanding, more uncertain. "We're just doing our job. We'll take care of her. Just step back and let us handle it." Jonathan couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Handle it?" he repeated, his voice incredulous. "You tased her. You didn't handle anything. You've made it worse." Angela, still on the ground, was starting to recover from the shock, but she was trembling, her breath shallow and quick. Jonathan knelt beside her again, trying to reassure her, though the anger was still bubbling up inside him. "I'm here, Angie. I won't let them hurt you anymore." The officers didn't move any closer. Instead, they seemed to be waiting, unsure of what to do next. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. It felt like everything had come to a standstill. Jonathan couldn't let this go on for much longer. He needed answers. He needed this madness to stop. After what seemed like an eternity, the officer who had been silent for most of the exchange finally spoke up. "Let's get her medical attention," he said. And we'll sort this out. Jonathan was skeptical. He didn't trust that they would truly make things right. But at least for now, it seemed like Angela would get the help she so desperately needed. Still, the events of the last few minutes had changed something inside of him. Jonathan had always been the kind of man who believed in the system. He had trusted that the law would protect him, that the people who served in law enforcement were there to uphold justice. But now, standing there in his own home, he realized that trust had been shattered. He couldn't forget what had happened, and the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this wasn't just about his wife or even about him. This was about something bigger. It was about the way people, especially people of color, were treated by those in power. It was about fairness and respect and justice. And it was clear to him now that those things were not guaranteed. They had to be fought for, and Jonathan wasn't ready to back down. Not now. Not ever. The air around Jonathan felt heavy, thick with uncertainty, as the officer who had tased Angela began to step back. It was a strange moment, a mix of relief, anger, and disbelief, all wrapped into one. The officers, who had been so forceful just moments ago, now appeared uncertain, almost hesitant. They hadn't apologized, they hadn't explained, but at least they seemed to be backing off. Jonathan stayed kneeling beside Angela, his hand gently brushing her hair from her face. She was still trembling, and her breath was coming in short, quick gasps. The shock of the taser had left her body weak, and her eyes were filled with confusion and pain. She didn't deserve any of this. She had done nothing wrong. "Angela, I'm so sorry," Jonathan whispered, his voice soft but full of emotion. His heart ached seeing her like this. They had come so far, surviving the hardships of his military career, building a life together, and finally settling into the peaceful home they had dreamed of. Yet in an instant, everything had changed. Their peace had been shattered, and now, it seemed like they were in a fight they didn't choose, facing a system that had turned on them when they least expected it. Angela's eyes fluttered open, her gaze blurry at first. It took a few moments before she could focus enough to meet his eyes. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but all that came out was a faint whisper. "Jonathan, what just happened?" Jonathan took her hand in his, holding it gently, reassuring her that he was there. "I don't know, Angie," he said, his voice trembling as he tried to stay composed. "I don't know, but we're going to figure this out. You're going to be okay." He looked over his shoulder at the officers, who were now standing further back, still hovering, but no longer closing in on them. They seemed to be waiting for something, maybe for Jonathan to calm down, maybe to figure out what their next move was. It felt like an eternity passed in silence. The situation had changed. Jonathan could feel it, but he wasn't sure what that meant just yet. The tension was still there, hanging in the air, waiting for the next step to unfold. One of the officers, the one who had been standing back and observing the scene without saying much, finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, more cautious than before. "We're going to get her some medical help," he said, motioning to one of the other officers to step forward. "She needs to be checked out." Jonathan didn't trust him. Not after what had just happened. Not after the way Angela had been treated. But he also knew that Angela needed help right now. She needed to be safe, and she needed to feel secure. His mind raced, and in that moment he made the decision to let the officers do their part, but only as long as they showed genuine care for her well-being. "Get her the help she needs," Jonathan said, his voice firm, but his eyes never leaving the officers. He wasn't going to let this go, not without answers. They couldn't just walk away from this, not after everything they had done. Angela was still shaking, but she nodded weakly, her eyes closed as the effects of the taser slowly wore off. Her breathing had become a little steadier, but she was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained. Jonathan stayed close to her, rubbing her hand gently, trying to calm her and assure her that everything would be okay. "Please, make sure she's okay," Jonathan said to the officer who had spoken. "She's been through enough tonight." The officer nodded, though it was clear he wasn't entirely sure how to proceed. He motioned for one of the medics, who had been standing off to the side, to approach. The medic stepped forward quickly, kneeling beside Angela. He checked her pulse, gently examining her body to ensure there were no lasting injuries from the taser. "Are you all right?" the medic asked Angela, his voice kind but firm, as he tried to assess the situation. Angela opened her eyes, her voice weak but steady. "I think so. I'm just so confused," she whispered. I know, the medic said, offering her a reassuring smile. "We're going to take care of you, all right?" Jonathan stayed by her side, watching closely as the medic worked. He could feel the anger bubbling up again, even though he was doing his best to keep it under control. This shouldn't have happened. They shouldn't be here like this, in this position. His wife shouldn't be lying on the ground, vulnerable, and hurt, because of a misunderstanding or poor judgment. As the medic finished his quick examination, he stood up and turned to Jonathan. "She's going to be all right, but we'll have to get her to the hospital for a more thorough checkup, just to be sure." Jonathan nodded, though his mind was still racing. He wanted to believe that the officers meant well, but the way they had treated Angela, the way they had shown no concern for her at first, it all left a bitter taste in his mouth. He had given so much to this country, fought for the very freedoms that were supposed to protect people like him and his wife. And now he was left wondering, where was that protection now? He turned back to Angela, his eyes softening as he gave her a gentle kiss on the forehead. "We're going to the hospital, all right? You're going to be okay. I won't leave your side." Angela's eyes fluttered closed again, and for a moment, Jonathan could see the exhaustion and fear in her face. But he also saw something else. Strength. Even in her weakened state, she was fighting. She had always been strong, and this moment, though frightening and painful, wouldn't break her. It wouldn't break them. One of the officers, the same one who had spoken earlier, now approached them. He seemed a little more relaxed, though still not fully at ease with the situation. "We're going to make sure everything gets sorted out," he said, his tone more conciliatory than before. "We're sorry this happened." Jonathan didn't respond right away. He just stared at the officer for a moment, feeling the weight of everything that had transpired. "Sorry doesn't change what happened," he finally said, his voice quiet but firm. "Sorry doesn't take back the pain she went through. But I'll take your word for it. For now." The officer nodded, looking down at the ground for a moment. "We'll make sure this gets looked into," he said, his voice softer. "You have our word." Jonathan didn't know if he could trust that. He didn't know if he would ever trust them again. But for now, he had to focus on getting Angela the help she needed. He wasn't going to let the anger cloud his judgment, or distract him from what mattered most: Angela's health, her safety. As the paramedics loaded Angela into the ambulance, Jonathan stayed close to her side. He could hear the sound of the siren as it blared in the distance, but for the first time tonight, it felt like a small comfort. They were going to be taken care of. Angela was going to get the attention she needed. As the ambulance pulled away, Jonathan stayed back for a moment, looking around at the officers still standing in front of his house. He felt a mix of frustration and uncertainty. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He knew that. He could feel it in his gut. There was still more to be done. But for now, he focused on one thing: getting to the hospital with Angela. He had no idea what would happen next, but he was certain of one thing. He wasn't going to let anyone forget what happened. This wasn't just about him and Angela. This was about something bigger. It was about the rights of people who felt powerless, the voices of those who were ignored, and Jonathan wasn't going to stay silent. The fight had only just begun. The drive to the hospital was long, and even though the sirens from the ambulance provided a constant reminder of the gravity of the situation, Jonathan couldn't shake the anger and confusion that had settled deep inside him. As he sat beside Angela in the back of the ambulance, his mind kept racing. He had watched the officers act without compassion, without understanding, and that angered him more than he ever thought possible. He had served this country, put his life on the line, and yet, in a moment of crisis, he and his wife were treated with complete disregard. Angela was quiet beside him, exhausted and shaken. The paramedics had checked her over once more, assuring them that her vitals were stable. But Jonathan could tell that the shock from the taser, combined with the emotional toll of what had happened, was weighing heavily on her. She had always been a strong woman, one who faced challenges with a calm and steady resolve, but even she couldn't mask the hurt and confusion in her eyes now. "How are you holding up?" Jonathan asked gently, his voice filled with concern. Angela turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes, but she didn't answer right away. Her lips parted as if to speak, but she seemed unsure of what to say. After a few seconds, she sighed, her chest heaving with the effort. "I don't even know what just happened, John. We were fine, and then everything went so wrong. I'm scared." Jonathan nodded, his heart breaking at the sound of her voice. He had never seen Angela look so vulnerable, so lost. It was hard to imagine the woman who had once been full of energy and strength, now looking so small and fragile. He took her hand, squeezing it tightly as if trying to reassure both of them. "I know, Angie, I know," he whispered. "But we're going to get through this. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere. No matter what happens, you're not alone in this." Angela's eyes filled with tears as she blinked them back. She nodded, but her gaze was distant, as if she were still trying to process everything. The ambulance ride felt like a blur, and when they finally arrived at the hospital, Jonathan barely noticed the passing moments. The staff at the emergency room moved quickly to get Angela the care she needed. Nurses and doctors surrounded her, assessing her condition, making sure she was stable. While they worked, Jonathan stood back, watching helplessly. He wanted to be closer to her, wanted to hold her hand and tell her everything would be okay, but he knew she needed medical attention first. His mind couldn't stop replaying the events from earlier that night, the officers barging into their home, the taser hitting Angela, her body going rigid and falling to the ground. It felt like it had happened to someone else, like it was all just a terrible dream. But it wasn't. It had happened, and it was real. And Jonathan was left to pick up the pieces. The anger still simmered inside him, but it was mixed with a sense of helplessness. What could he do now? He had tried to stand up for his wife, tried to protect her when the system had failed them. But now what? Where could they turn for justice when the very people who were supposed to uphold it had let them down so drastically? As the doctors continued their work, Jonathan found a seat in the waiting room, his hands clenched tightly together in his lap. He felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He couldn't just let this go. He couldn't pretend like everything was fine and go back to his life as though nothing had happened. He couldn't erase the fear in Angela's eyes or the way the officers had treated them. And yet, despite the overwhelming frustration and anger he felt, there was still a small spark of determination inside him. He wasn't going to sit back and let this injustice slip away without a fight. Hours seemed to pass before the doctor finally walked into the waiting room. Jonathan stood up immediately, his heart racing. The doctor was a middle-aged man, wearing a white coat with a calm demeanor. He looked like he had seen a lot in his time, but there was something different in the way he looked at Jonathan. A hint of empathy, perhaps, that felt comforting in a time like this. "Mr. Taylor?" the doctor asked, his voice kind but professional. Jonathan nodded quickly, feeling a mix of relief and nervousness. "How is she? Is she okay?" "Your wife is stable," the doctor replied. "Her heart rate and blood pressure are returning to normal, which is a good sign. The taser did cause some muscle spasms, but thankfully, there doesn't seem to be any permanent damage. We'll keep her here overnight for observation, but I think she'll be okay." Jonathan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Thank you. That's good to hear." The doctor smiled briefly, but it was a tired smile. "I understand this is a difficult time, and I can see how shaken you both must be. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We'll be keeping an eye on her." Jonathan nodded, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. As the doctor left, he felt a sense of relief, but it was fleeting. The real fight was just beginning, and he had no idea what kind of battle he was about to face. He walked back to Angela's room, his steps slow and deliberate. When he opened the door, he saw her lying in the bed, her eyes closed as she rested. The harsh fluorescent lights above cast a pale glow on her face, but she looked peaceful in her sleep. Still, Jonathan couldn't shake the image of her on the ground, twitching from the shock of the taser. He pulled up a chair and sat beside her bed, watching her as she slept. The hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of the machines monitoring her condition. The stillness felt surreal, like time had slowed down. Jonathan took her hand again, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand, trying to offer her some comfort. Angela stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. She looked up at him, and for a moment she seemed disoriented, unsure of where she was. But then her eyes focused on him, and she gave him a small, tired smile. "Hey," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You're still here?" "Of course I am," Jonathan replied softly, brushing a lock of hair from her forehead. "I'm not going anywhere. You're going to be okay. You're strong, and we'll get through this. Together." Angela's smile faded as she looked up at him, her expression serious. "But what now, John? What happens next? I don't even know where to begin with all of this." Jonathan sat up straighter, his mind clear now. "We're going to make sure this doesn't just go away. What happened to you wasn't right. We have to fight for justice. For you, and for everyone who's ever been treated this way." Angela was quiet for a moment, and Jonathan could see the wheels turning in her head. "I don't know if we can fight this," she said quietly. "What if we lose? What if it's all too much?" Jonathan squeezed her hand, looking her in the eye. "We're not going to lose. We're not giving up. What happened tonight, it's bigger than just us. This is about standing up for what's right, and we're going to make sure people hear us. We're going to make them listen." Angela studied his face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Okay, if you think we can do this, then I'm with you." Jonathan smiled, relief flooding through him. "We'll do it together," he said, his voice firm with resolve. One step at a time. The road ahead would be difficult, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Jonathan felt a sense of clarity. The fight for justice wasn't just about winning, it was about standing up, being heard, and demanding respect for themselves and for everyone who had ever been wronged. And he wasn't about to stop now. He wouldn't let what had happened to Angela be forgotten. They were going to make sure of that. The days that followed were a blur of emotions. Jonathan and Angela had been through so much, and they had only just begun to process everything. As Angela continued to recover, both physically and emotionally, Jonathan became more determined than ever to ensure that the events of that night didn't go unnoticed. The officers who had hurt his wife couldn't just walk away from what they had done. He couldn't let them. Jonathan spent the next few days gathering his thoughts, making calls, and reaching out to anyone who could help. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult, but he wasn't about to back down. The support from Angela, though quiet, gave him strength. She was still recovering, still finding her way back to the woman she was before that night, but she was with him. She wanted justice too, and that shared sense of purpose brought them closer together than ever before. Their story quickly made the rounds in the media. News outlets began reporting on what had happened, and the public was outraged. People all over the country were shocked by the story of a black veteran's wife being tased in front of him for no reason other than a police misunderstanding. It didn't take long for the pressure to build. Calls for accountability came from everywhere, from neighbors, from friends, from complete strangers who saw the injustice in the situation. It seemed like everyone had an opinion, and most of them were in support of Jonathan and Angela. Jonathan had never been one for the spotlight. He had always preferred to keep a low profile, living quietly with his wife. But now everything was different. The incident had brought them to the forefront of a conversation about racial inequality, police brutality, and the treatment of veterans. The last thing he ever expected was to be part of something this big, but now that he was determined to make it count. The public response was overwhelming. People reached out with messages of support, many of them veterans themselves who shared their own stories of feeling dismissed or ignored by the very system they had fought to protect. Jonathan realized that this wasn't just about his family. It was about so many others who had been affected by similar issues, whether directly or indirectly. One afternoon, as Jonathan sat in his living room, looking through the growing pile of letters, phone calls, and messages, Angela walked into the room. She had made great progress in her recovery, but she was still feeling the emotional weight of the trauma. She sat down next to him, her eyes tired but determined. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft but steady. "We have to do something with all this attention. We can't let it go to waste." Jonathan looked at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean?" Angela looked at him with a quiet intensity. "We've been given a platform. People are listening. This could be the chance to make a real change, not just for us, but for others who've been through the same thing. We can't just sit back and let it all fade away." Jonathan's heart swelled with pride. Angela had always been the voice of reason, the one who thought through things when he was caught up in the moment. But now he could see her strength, shining through, and it filled him with hope. They could do this. They had to. "We'll make them hear us," Jonathan said quietly, but with certainty. They knew that their fight for justice would not be easy. They knew that the system, no matter how much it may appear to be on their side now, would fight back. There would be legal battles, there would be delays, and there would be many moments where they felt like giving up, but they weren't going to. Not now. Together, they began to build a case. Jonathan contacted lawyers who specialized in civil rights and police misconduct. He met with people who had been through similar experiences, gathering information, understanding their pain, and figuring out how to move forward. Angela, though still healing, supported him every step of the way. She helped with the phone calls, the paperwork, and the emotional support that Jonathan needed. She even began speaking out publicly, sharing their story in interviews with reporters who were eager to listen. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan became more active in local community meetings, talking to people who had been impacted by police violence, discrimination, and inequality. He wasn't doing it for recognition, but for the simple belief that something needed to change. People had to see the real impact of what happened that night, not just the physical effects, but the emotional toll it took on both of them. The legal process moved slowly, but the community's support never wavered. Protests began to grow, people wearing shirts that said, "Justice for Angela," and "We stand with Jonathan." The couple's story had sparked something much bigger than they had ever expected. It wasn't just about one man and his wife anymore. It was about people coming together to demand accountability from those who were meant to protect them. There were moments when it felt like they were fighting a losing battle. Legal battles took months with delays and paperwork piling up. The police department initially tried to downplay the severity of the situation, attempting to justify their actions. The officers involved in the incident went through internal reviews, but it seemed like no one was truly held accountable. But Jonathan and Angela kept pushing. They refused to let their voices be silenced. They knew that the fight for justice wasn't just about winning a case. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure that what happened to them didn't happen to others. As time passed, the case began to gain momentum. More and more people rallied behind them. Public opinion turned in their favor, and slowly, the pressure began to mount on the police department to take real action. Jonathan and Angela knew that this wasn't the end. They still had a long way to go. But with every step, they grew stronger. One day, after months of legal battles, protests, and interviews, they received the news they had been hoping for. The police department had agreed to settle. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step in the right direction. The officers involved in the incident were held accountable, and a public apology was issued. It was a bittersweet moment for Jonathan and Angela. They had fought for justice, and while the outcome wasn't perfect, it was a significant win. It was a victory not just for them, but for everyone who had ever felt powerless against a system that didn't always protect them. "We did it," Angela whispered, her voice full of emotion. She looked at Jonathan with tears in her eyes. "We really did it." Jonathan pulled her into a hug, holding her close. "We did," he said softly. "Together." The fight wasn't over, though. They knew that there was still much work to be done. Their victory was just one small part of the larger movement for change, but they had made a difference. They had shown that when people come together, when they stand up for what's right, change is possible. As they stood together hand in hand, Jonathan realized something important. It wasn't just about winning this battle. It was about standing up, speaking out, and refusing to let injustice slide. It was about making sure that their story, and the stories of countless others, would never be forgotten. They had started with one voice, but now they had a community behind them. They had sparked a movement, and Jonathan knew that as long as they continued to fight, they could make the world a better, more just place for everyone. And that, he thought, was worth everything they had gone through.